For decades, UFO researchers have asserted that these odd craft possess some kind of connection with active volcanoes. Well, not always active, but volcanoes anyway. Craft that appear to have the capacity to disregard the volcanic plumes of these fierce mountains when they're amid an eruption. Craft that at times seem to be directing toward the craters of these mountains, both of which should be utterly impossible for an ordinary object, whether that be a bird or an airplane or something else. And in addition to that, sometimes laser beams are captured operating amid volcanic eruptions, which is a quite strange thing too. But all of these sightings and all of this footage theoretically could be prone to misidentification or camera deception and fakes. However, recently a case was disclosed to AARO, to the group with the Pentagon, tasked with examining military UFO sightings that an object was observed soaring through the plume of an active volcano, Mount Etna. And this footage continued for quite some time. And according to the analyst, the object was moving far too swiftly to be a balloon or a bird or some kind of regular, mundane object. And if it were an airplane, well, it shouldn't have been able to disregard the plume of an active volcano. AARO performed an analysis of this case, reached the conclusion that it was indeed a mundane object. Unsurprisingly so, but interestingly enough, several of the independent research teams that AARO hires to do their analysis for them had very different conclusions, as did the professional drone operator who disclosed the case initially. And AARO was kind enough to share their findings too, and it was radically different from what AARO thought. At least two of these independent research teams concluded that the object did indeed pass through the volcanic plume, and one of them concluded that the object was moving at hypersonic velocities. Music. Good afternoon, alien fans, and welcome to another Angry Alien Bulletin. I've had a chance to examine a number of AARO's case resolution reports. All kind of tends to center around the same sort of approach. The idea behind it is, well, the observer and the person who was capturing the footage did not really grasp what they were viewing or the distance that was involved, that sort of thing. And the object was either much farther away than they believed or far nearer. Actually, the far nearer explanation seems to arise a lot more often than anything else. And of course, if it's far nearer, then it's traveling much, much slower than the observer believed. Again, we're talking about skilled drone operators who are supposed to possess a pretty good sense of what they're observing, especially if you're discussing distance and speed and those sorts of details. But nevertheless, those are the kinds of conclusions that AARO often reaches. But perhaps the most intriguing case of all that AARO supplied a case resolution report on is the so-called Mount Etna event. And as I noted at the start of the video, this is something that occurs very frequently with UFO sightings, UFOs that appear to be functioning in the vicinity of active volcanoes, sometimes plunging through the plumes of these volcanoes as they erupt, or sometimes descending in the craters of these volcanoes as if they possess some sort of base situated there. But in this particular case, we actually possess military footage, military surveillance, footage of a UFO seemingly doing just that, not descending in the crater or anything like that, but traversing through the plume of an active volcano without that plume impacting it at all, which should be impossible. All the air patterns around an active volcano should offer a lot of disruption to the air, currents, winds, that sort of thing. And any vehicle that is reckless enough to pass through a volcano's plume is going to be notably affected by all of that. In addition, volcano plumes have a lot of dust, grit, dirt, lava, that sort of thing in it that can be extremely dangerous to aircraft or any other human-made object. A balloon, of course, might be able to traverse it, But again, balloons are completely dependent on air currents, and so therefore any balloon that traverses a volcano's plume is going to be notably impacted by that. And yet this object doesn't appear to be affected at all. It's a very, very compelling case. And once again, unlike all the other footage that we observe of UFOs supposedly passing near to erupting volcanoes or descending in craters, that sort of thing, this was captured by military surveillance footage. Therefore, we're not discussing any sort of alterations here, any sort of CGI being used, or any other camera trickery that might be involved here. And we don't have to worry about the trustworthiness of the witnesses either, at least not theoretically. That makes this case very challenging indeed. But AARO was pleased to supply their case resolution report, where they reached the conclusion that this, like all the other cases they resolve, was a mundane object of some kind that didn't traverse through the volcanic plume. But what made this case resolution report much more intriguing than most was the fact that they shared alternative hypotheses, alternative theories that some of their military analysts, some of their partners reached. In other words, we're discussing people who are trained in analyzing this kind of footage, who have a very good grasp of how aeronautical engineering and air currents, that sort of thing, all of this functions, and they reached very different conclusions. One of these partners, actually two of these partners, concluded that the object did indeed traverse through the volcanic plume, and one of them concluded that the object traversed through the plume at hypersonic speed. So this drone operator succeeded in capturing some pretty remarkable footage of Mount Etna while it was in the process of erupting. Etna is a Sicilian stratovolcano, the types of volcanoes that can erupt violently. Unlike the volcanoes that one observes in Iceland and Hawaii that have sort of slow-moving lava flows, this one resembles Mount St. Helens. Instead, it is capable of massively powerful explosive eruptions that can sometimes be more powerful than nuclear blasts. And this volcano has been in a near constant state of eruption in recent years. A lava flow from one of the largest eruptions in 1669 overran the western suburbs of the nearby Sicilian town of Catania. Etna holds significant economic importance for Sicily, with nearly 1/3 of the island's population living on the slopes of the volcano. Terrifyingly enough, partly because volcanic soils are fertile for agriculture and partly because of tourism. In December 2018, a shortwave infrared camera aboard a U.S. military unmanned aerial system, or UAS, operating near the U.S. Naval Air Station, Sigonella, and I may be mispronouncing a lot of this. I apologize to all the Italian speakers, but in any event, it's over the Mediterranean Sea south of Sicily. This drone captured 12 minutes of infrared video of an eruption of Mount Etna, and for approximately 4.5 minutes, a round object appeared on the video and seemed to exhibit anomalous performance characteristics by moving at high speeds and transiting a superheated gas and ash plume produced by the eruption. The UAS operator reported that the object's flight behavior was seemingly unaffected by transiting the plume, with no discernible impact on its performance, altitude, or bearing. The operator reported that the object speed was approximately 555 kilometers per hour, or 345 mph. The reported altitude was 15,000 foot. Now again, what makes this object so unusual is the fact that it seems to be transiting a volcanic plume. You can see it vanish and then reappear periodically. It definitely seems to be affected by the plume itself, at least in terms of it being visible are concerned. And again, this is a thermal trace, so the heat that it's giving off is being affected by the ash and smoke that's between the observer and the object. At least that's the interpretation that the drone operator had, that this was not an object operating in front of the plume, but rather an object moving through the plume. And given the distance between the drone and the volcano, it had to be traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour. And as a matter of fact, as you're going to see a little bit later on, other analysts conclude that it was actually moving much, much faster than that. Now, from a morphological standpoint, this object appears to be spherical, and it bears a great deal of resemblance to another famous piece of AARO footage, the so-called Middle East sphere, that was captured for a much shorter period of time by another drone operator. Once again, these drone operators seem very interested in what they're tracking. Here, it does seem to be different than the other objects that they routinely see all the time. And again, given that this operator was interested in the volcanic explosion, clearly Mount Etna had sort of captivated him for a while. To suddenly see this object appear and fly by in close proximity to the volcanic plume must have been pretty startling for him. But once again, as you're going to see, AARO came to some very different conclusions as to what this object actually was and where it actually was and how fast it was traveling. But this is one of the most astonishing pieces of UAP footage that I have ever seen, simply because there's so much of it, minute after minute after minute. Look at that. Wow. Where did it go? Either experienced a sudden deceleration, or the drone operator just lost track of it for a moment. Although these things are set up to track these sorts of objects pretty accurately. So, I don't know. It may have changed its velocity. But again, this can't be a bird, at least not if it's flying through the volcanic plume. It can't be a balloon. That would really, really affect its path. Music in flight. All of the changing and swirling air currents around a volcano, plus all of the ash and soot and other things in a volcanic plume. I can't imagine that a balloon would even survive the experience, and nor would a bird make the decision to fly through a plume either. And I can't see how it would survive the experience. And again, something else with engines, with jet engines, propellers, that sort of thing. Ash is notoriously dangerous for these kinds of craft. Ash tends to get sucked into engine parts, into air intakes for helicopters, jet engines, that sort of thing, and can often take those kinds of craft down. So, if we're talking about an object that was passing through the plume, if that is indeed what happened here, then it's definitely displaying anomalous flight capabilities. And it appears at this point that the drone operator lost track of the object. The operator searches and searches for several minutes, but can find no trace of the object that he was tracking. And this is going to be very important when we talk about AARO's final assessment of this sighting and why their conclusions are a bit erroneous given the visible evidence. All right, so those are the facts surrounding the Mount Etna case. Now, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the conclusions that AARO came to regarding this case. Going to go ahead and examine the mundane explanation, shall we say, that AARO came to on Mount Etna. And again, I don't see why they would come to any other conclusions. When it comes down to it, is their job to assign mundane explanations to these things. So let's have a look at what AARO had to say. Okay, so AARO's assessment was that the object was actually moving at about 39 km per hour, or 24 miles per hour, moving west to east, consistent with wind speed and direction. The object's apparent high speed is attributable to motion parallax. They talk a lot about this. This is like their go-to explanation for just about every UAP sighting. Motion parallax is an optical effect that induces an observer to perceive that a stationary or slow-moving object is moving much faster than its actual speed when viewed from a moving frame of reference. The more quickly an observer moves relative to an observed object, the more pronounced this effect is. The UES platform's relative motion made the object appear to move at high speeds. Now, how is that possible? If the object was so far away, the relative speed of the UES should not have had that big of an impact on the object's motion. But here's the reason. It's because AARO estimated that the object's distance from a UAS platform by comparing its speed, the cloud deck's apparent motion, and the wind speed to plot its trajectory. In other words, they were using the wind speed as sort of a biased detail to determine the actual distance that was involved. AARO applied comprehensive full motion video analysis, 3D modeling, pixel examination, and wind speed calculations to assess that the object was much closer to the drone than initially reported. The object did not pass through the volcano's ash plume. The object was approximately 170 kilometers away from the plume during the recording. In other words, this thing was far closer to the drone than the drone operator thought. And as you're going to find out later, much closer than a couple of the independent analysts thought that the object was from the drone as well. So their overall conclusion was that the object was only 30 kilometers away from the sensor. And here's a diagram of the actual flight path of the object versus the location of the volcano. A radical difference. A huge mistake that was made in distance estimation from this trained drone operator. But once again, maybe so. AARO employed pixel examination, also to conclude with moderate confidence that the object was spherical, probably a balloon. That's a go-to explanation with an approximate diameter of 0.3 m or 1 foot, a perfect size for a balloon. Due to the object size and performance characteristics, AARO assesses with moderate confidence that it is a balloon. But once again, high confidence according to what they had to say that it wasn't demonstrating any sort of anomalous flight characteristics, and it didn't fly through the plume at all. AARO also includes some details about the sensor being employed. These sensors do not employ active range. Finding and obtaining the accurate range to a target is highly dependent on environmental factors, the thermally turbulent atmospheric conditions near an actively erupting volcano likely disrupted the sensor's ability to capture accurate data. Volcanic ash composed of fine particulate scatters and absorbs infrared radiation in unpredictable ways, creating a noisy thermal environment. These conditions further reduce the sensor's accuracy by distorting this. I'd love to hear what you think about this, so drop a comment below. If you enjoyed our conversation today, please share this video and subscribe to help the channel grow. Every bit of support counts.